Welcome to 10-Minute History Lessons, the show where history should be short but never forgotten. I'm your host, Antonio Milian. In every episode, we pack centuries of stories, struggles, and scandals into just 10 minutes or less. From the footnotes you skipped in school to the figures that they tried to erase, we dig up the untold, the overlooked, and the straight-up unbelievable parts of the past. So grab your coffee, your commute, and your curiosity, and let's travel real quick. Our first story takes us to Massachusetts, to a scandal that happened, and it was actually one of the very first Ponzi schemes in American history. It was by a woman named Sarah Howe, and she started her own bank exclusively for women. Now let's rewind the clock back to a time where women couldn't even vote and see how one woman took advantage of building a criminal empire. Sarah Howe was born in 1826 in Massachusetts. Not much is known about her childhood, but by the time she reached adulthood, she had already developed a reputation for being persuasive and shrewd. She worked as a fortune teller and a spiritualist in her younger years. Now, this might be something that sounds new because of our TikTok generation and the fact that every time I turn on live, I see someone reading fortunes or playing with tarot cards. But back then, it was a very lucrative and common hustle for women who wanted some financial independence in a male-dominated world. It was in those spiritual circles that Sarah first learned how to read people and, most importantly, how to manipulate them out of their money. By the 1870s, Sarah launched what she called the Ladies' Deposit Company in Boston. The pitch was irresistible. It was a woman's only bank where women could safely deposit their savings away from the control of their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their priests, or any other male influence in their life. She told potential clients that the bank had access to a secret charity fund and that it could only offer incredible interest rates, sometimes as high as 8% per month. In an era where women were often excluded from financial institutions, many saw her as a savior. But here's the catch. There was no secret charity. There was no investment. Sarah was simply taking the money to pay off old ones. A textbook Ponzi scheme before the term even existed. Why did she do it? Well, money, of course. But it wasn't just about greed. Sarah seemed to enjoy the power and prestige that came along with running her own financial institution. Something few women could even dream of at the time. She also knew her audience. Women with modest savings, no access to financial advice, and few legal protections. At the height of the Ladies' Deposit, Sarah had over $500,000, equivalent to nearly $15 million today. And she didn't reinvest the money or spend it appropriately. She spent it on herself. With the stolen money, Sarah lived lavishly. She bought fancy dresses, houses, cars. Well, not cars. Cars weren't invented then, but you get the drift. Fine jewelry, and she dined at the most expensive restaurants and threw herself into Boston's high society scene. She also paid off earlier investors, just enough to keep the illusion alive. People would receive the interest, tell their friends, and the scam would grow. And it worked until it didn't. In 1880, a local newspaper started asking questions. Some of the women weren't receiving their promised interest anymore. A Boston newspaper called the Boston Daily Advertiser ran an expose on how her operation was working and eventually exposed it as a fraud. Article caused a run on the bank. Everyone tried to take their money out. When women came to withdraw their money, though, there was no money. There was nothing left at all. Sarah was immediately arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud. During her trial, she showed no remorse, still claiming that the bank was legitimate. She was convicted in 1881 and sentenced to 3 years in prison. But here's the wild part. When she got out, she tried the same exact scam again. She launched another fake investment fund targeting women and even used the same marketing tactics. But this time, law enforcement and the press were ready. She was arrested again in 1881 and sentenced to another term behind bars. She eventually faded from public view, living the rest of her life in relative obscurity. She died in 1892, her name mostly forgotten. It wasn't until decades later where historians later discovered she was one of America's earliest and most audacious financial scammers. Sarah Howe wasn't just a scammer. She was a product of her time, exploiting a society that systemically excluded women from financial knowledge and power. But her story still matters today because financial fraud hasn't gone anywhere. It's just evolved. It's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, it's in your DMs, it's in shady crypto promises and crypto bros and fake investment gurus. It's even on your podcast. The lesson: if someone promises you easy money, they're probably the only one that's getting rich. Now, our second story today takes us across the Atlantic to Ireland in the 19th century, where one man's name became a verb that's even used around the world today. You've probably used it before yourself: boycott. But did you know that it came from a real person, a man named Charles Boycott? And let's just say things didn't end well for him. And today we're unpacking the story of Charles Boycott, who he was, why people hated him, and how this man and his name became a symbol of resistance to violence. Charles Cunningham Boycott was born on March 12, 1832, in Norfolk, England. His family was part of the minor gentry, landowners with just enough money to keep their son out of trouble. Young Charles didn't exactly shine in school, but he had enough standing and money to join the British Army, where he served as the 39th Foot Regiment. After years of uneventful service, he left the military and made his way to Ireland. Now, here's where things get interesting. Ireland in the 1800s was still reeling from the Great Famine, also known as the Irish Potato Famine. The land was controlled mostly by wealthy English landlords, and Irish tenant farmers had little to no power. They worked the land, paid the rent, and prayed for a good harvest. If crops failed, they still owed rent. If they couldn't pay, they would be evicted. Boycott ended up working for one of those English landlords, a man named Lord Ernie. He managed Ernie's estate in County Mayo on the western coast of Ireland. This made him what was known as the land agent, basically a middleman who collected rent from tenants and carried out evictions when necessary. If there's one thing Charles Boycott was good at, it was following orders. In 1880, the Irish Land League was gaining power. They were fighting for tenants' rights, fair rent, fixed tenures, and free sale. The 3 Fs, as they called it. That year, after a particularly bad harvest, Lord Ernie's tenants asked for a 25% reduction in rent. Lord Ernie offered 10%. The tenants refused. And Boycott, he started issuing eviction notices. Now imagine this: you're living in poverty, struggling to feed your kids, And this Englishman tells you that you're being kicked off the land your family has worked for generations. People were angry, not just a little angry. They were ready to do something about it. But instead of violence, the Irish League tried something new. They told the community, don't touch him. Don't talk to him. Don't trade with him. Don't even help him. And suddenly, Charles Boycott was a man alone. His workers stopped working. The postman stopped delivering his mail. Shops refused to serve him. His crops began to rot in the field because no one would harvest them. Even the blacksmith refused to shoe his horses. Desperate, Boycott wrote a letter to the Times of London complaining about his treatment. A story gained national attention. The British government panicked and sent 50 soldiers and a dozen volunteers to help him harvest his crops. At a cost of £10,000 to save about 500 pounds worth of potatoes. It was a massive, embarrassing overreaction. And it made Boycott a household name, but not in the way he wanted. Newspapers started using his name as a noun and a verb. To boycott. Someone means to socially and economically isolate them. The word spread like wildfire. Within months, it was being used in Parliament. Within a few years, it was in dictionaries. And today, it's used globally. Whether you're talking about refusing to shop at a company or entire movements of justice. As for Charles Boycott, he left Ireland humiliated. He returned to England and lived out the rest of his life quietly. He died in 1897 at the age of 65. He never got revenge, he never reclaimed his reputation, and he certainly never got to rewrite the word that immortalized him. Charles Boycott didn't invent social protest, but his name became its symbol. And here's the real twist. The movement that ruined him wasn't violent. It wasn't led by politicians or generals. It was ordinary people, farmers, workers, neighbors, who decided they didn't need guns to fight back. Just silence, unity, just refusal. And that's the power of collective action. Next time you hear about someone being boycotted, remember, it all started with one man, one injustice, and one community that had enough. Our third story today takes us back to the United States, to the South. But let's start off with a question. What would you do if you had the voice of a legend, but none of the fame? If you were told you sounded like the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, would you leave it at karaoke or would you take it a little further? We're going to dive into the story of a soulful, bold criminal named Vicki Jones, the woman who once took the stage as the Queen of Soul herself and got away with it. Vicki Jones was born and raised in Virginia, where gospel music was more than just entertainment. It was a lifestyle. Like many Black women of the time, she grew up singing in church, belting out hymns that shook the rafters and stirred souls. People around her noticed her gift early, but there was something special about her voice. She sounded eerily like someone they recognized. Not just anyone, Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul herself. The woman who turned gospel roots into Grammy gold. And that's the voice. That voice would become Vicki's ticket and her tramp. By the 1960s, Aretha Franklin was a bright star. She didn't walk into a room. She floated. And Vicki Jones, she was still singing locally, still chasing rent, still just trying to make ends meet. And that's when she met Lavelle Hardy, a promoter with a shady streak and an ear for opportunity. He heard her sing and said, "You sound exactly like Aretha. Let's make you some money." Now, this wasn't just some tribute act at a lounge. Hardy convinced Jones to pretend to be Aretha Franklin. Full-on impersonation, booking gigs, selling tickets, using Aretha's name, all without the real Aretha Franklin knowing. And the craziest part is, it worked. In 1969, Jones was flown down to Florida, where under Hardy's direction. According to some accounts, Hardy threatened her, saying she owed him for expenses and couldn't back out. Scared and unsure, Jones took the stage. And the crowd, they went wild. People truly believed they were in the presence of the real Aretha Franklin. Vicki Jones's performance was so convincing, so full of passion and precision, that fans walked away with no idea they just witnessed a scam. She did 4 shows in Florida before anyone caught on. So how did the real Aretha Franklin find out? Well, it didn't take long. The music world isn't that big. And when somebody as famous as Aretha Franklin is supposed to perform for pennies in Florida, word spread. A tip made its way to Aretha's camp, and they were like, "Excuse me?" She wasn't even in the state at the time. Authorities were alerted, and Vicki was arrested for impersonation and fraud. But here's the twist. When she went to court, the judge let her go. Why? Because Vicki testified that she was coerced by Hardy. She told the court she didn't want to do it, but felt she had no choice. The judge actually said, quote, "She sings too well for her own good." Case dismissed. Hardy, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. He got locked up. And it's also believed that Aretha Franklin stuck up for Vicki Jones when she found out, knowing that Lavelle Hardy was coercing her. Talk about girls supporting girls. So what happened to Vicki Jones after the Aretha Franklin adventure? For a minute there, she got a little taste of fame. Reporters were fascinated. She was invited to sing as herself on a few stages. She even had a brief, modest musical career. But she never reached Aretha Franklin levels. How could she? Still, she gained something that can't be measured in records sold: respect. People realized she wasn't a con artist by heart. She was just a woman with a voice too powerful to ignore, caught in a moment she didn't fully control. As for Aretha, she reportedly laughed it off. No lawsuits, no diva drama. Maybe she respected the hustle. Maybe she knew that no matter how good Vicki was, there was only one Queen of Soul. And that's the story of how one woman, one voice, and one shady promoter pulled off the greatest soul impersonation of all time and walked away singing. Thanks for listening today to 10-Minute History Lessons. I'm Antonio Milian, your host. If you like the podcast, don't forget to like, share, and give 5 stars wherever you listen. See you next time.